One, the language we repeatedly hear, in at least in my experience in the UK and the Europe, but I gather it's the same in the States, is the cost of living crisis, austerity, that we haven't got any. We are incredibly wealthy. I mean, if I just think about the UK, government's been banging on for years now about the cost of living crisis. We don't have a cost of living crisis. We have an equity crisis. We've got, what, 68, 69 million people living in the UK. And in absolute terms, we're the 6th or 7th richest country in the world with only 0.84% of the world's population. So a really small percentage of the world's population. And we're incredibly wealthy, yet we still use the language of austerity and cost of living crisis. There is no cost of living crisis other than the one that is deliberately imposed because we want to hand out the huge wealth and the annual income of the UK to a small group of people, relatively small group of people. And that language, of course, is reinforced by the journalists. So we then live again in another imaginary world rather than the real world where we have huge resources in somewhere like the UK. But that's true of a lot of the global north countries. So we could easily be addressing these challenges, but it's where do we ascribe the resources? And then going back to, you mentioned the pandemic. In the UK, and I think this happened elsewhere, every Thursday evening, people would come out of their houses and get a pan and bang it to thank the wonderful workers who literally were putting their lives on the line, whether that's the bus drivers or whether it was the nurses or some of the other medics or the ancillary staff in the hospitals. People doing it, or people working in the supermarkets, across the board. But a lot of these people were the people who were the least well paid in our society. So we weren't prepared to pay them, but we were prepared to bang pans for them. And at the end of that, we never ended up paying them anymore anyway. So we just let them die in larger numbers, and with this sort of pretense that we cared. But I think that also demonstrated again, where is the true value in our society? Were we really short of billionaires during the pandemic, or were we short of these people who were, or these people we really had to value, who were making the system still operate at significant risk to themselves? So I think there are lessons to learn from that, which we did not learn. We didn't relearn that actually real value is not where we're placing it at the moment. There are lots of people in our society who do wonderful work that we just take for granted. And if you think of it like that, then you start to think, well, there's huge resources in our society that we can mobilize in different ways. But our governments are reluctant to do that. And partly because they come from those backgrounds themselves, but also because they know that who owns the mainstream media is the very wealthy. So and the business leaders and all the others. So the narrative around any sort of change that is going to be socially progressive is going to be one that is opposing it. It's not that most people are against it, but the narrative that will be dominating the media is one that's against it. And that in that way, I think the system we have today is sort of locked into failure. And until we can break out of that. And some of the disruption that we've seen over recent years maybe suggest there were early signs of that. And I'm not saying any of these are necessarily good, but if you go from Brexit to the yellow vests in France, to what's happened in the US, that you can look at these in different ways. I'm not trying to make any comment about whether it's good or bad. All I'm simply making the comment is there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the establishment has been for a long time. And perhaps it isn't perhaps these are all signals of a sign of unrest that could be precursors or symbols of a need for some sort of change. Now, that change, of course, could go in a really negative direction, which at the moment is probably more suggesting it's going to do that, the more progressive direction. But perhaps those degrees of unrest are there, and that is a point at which you can see change, if you like, a social tipping point. Maybe we've seen some early signs that it's there. But I say it doesn't seem to me at the moment that it's tipping in a more progressive direction. It seems to almost going the other way. Going back to your point about we've moved from a sort of rules-based society, but I think it had huge problems with it anyway. But we've moved from that to supposedly powerful men, otherwise known as bullies in this case, and the art of the deal and this sort of framing. Yeah, I could be wrong with this. I hope it doesn't last, but I also hope we don't go back to exactly the rules-based system that we had before, because that had locked in all sorts of problems and inequalities and opium nonsense that is typically sold. We mustn't take away people's hope. Well, I mean, who's us? Who are we to then think we should have to be dishonest about, or at least to spin a narrative that's appealing to others? That's not our job as experts, as academics. We have to say it as we see it. And in my view, very clearly, we have gone backwards because the challenge we face today is so much more difficult than it was in 2015, And remember, it's even more difficult than it was if you go back to the UNFCCC you referred to earlier. That was back in 1992. You know, it's a third of a century ago, and yet emissions are still going up. So a third of a century since our first major agreement, emissions are still rising. We've put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since our first agreement on climate change than we put in all human history up to that point. So I think any reasoned assessment of the problem that we face, understanding that the problem is cumulative, has to come up with the conclusion that we have failed and we are continuing to fail. I would even go slightly further and say that on the 1.5 degree C framing of the Paris Agreement, that's gone. We will not be able to hold to warming of only 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I also have to reflect on that and say that here I am sat in Sweden, in the Northern Hemisphere, relatively wealthy white person, older man in the Northern Hemisphere, saying we've failed at 1.5. And to recognise, I have to think, stop and reflect, what does that mean? Well, that means that the lives and the livelihoods, or the livelihoods and the lives of some people, particularly poorer communities in the global south, those we have sacrificed their lives. Because it's not as if we didn't know about this, we did. And so the high emitters in our countries and the leaders in our countries, that we have actively and knowingly chosen not to make major cuts in our emissions, because we weren't prepared to make the sort of changes to our society that are necessary. And we are prepared to rip apart the lives and livelihoods of people in the global south, but also impose significant risks on our own children's prospects. I mean, it doesn't play out well for us when we think about, well, what does that mean about us as people? You know, we might have a facade that is one of caring, but is it really? How deep is that caring? I don't think, for us high emitters that have been part of this problem and knowing and understanding the issues, I would say that our care hasn't even stretched to our own children, let alone people elsewhere in the world. And it's a sort of, well, sometimes when I stop, it's a dark place for me, that almost more than the science. I feel that's quite a dark place, because I think humanity can be much more than that. But there's something about the structures, the cultural structures that have dominated, particularly in the global north, that have underplayed our value as a citizen in this, and have overplayed our competitive consumer elements, if you like. And so I think we need to return to seeing ourselves as citizens, as parents, as brothers, as sisters, as members of our community, and also members of a global community, because we live in a globalized world. Our impacts are felt elsewhere. Other people's impacts are felt where we are. And to understand that, and through that lens of science can help understand this, then I think it might move us in a more positive direction.